As you may know, if you've been around here for a while, I love bluegrass music. For my installation almost 7 years ago, Kelly hired a bluegrass band to play on what turned out to be for us a really cold and windy November afternoon. The banjo players wore gloves. I had never seen that before. I grew up with a mix of bluegrass and Southern gospel music. And though the theology of those songs is not mine anymore, I still love the musical tradition. When people ask me where I'm from, I almost always say Southern Indiana, and the southern part is really important. Because as Craig Furman said in an article for 538.com entitled, "Indiana is Weird," Indiana was settled in a couple different ways, but mainly from the south up. So people from Kentucky and other parts of the American South settled the hills and hollers that I'm from in southern Indiana. So the part of Indiana where I grew up is truly a southern culture, while a 2-hour drive to Indianapolis puts a person in a very different, more northern culture. Indiana really is weird. So I, in a lot of ways a southern boy from a northern state who loves bluegrass, decided last fall that I would learn to play the banjo so that I could better play some of the music that I love. I had this vague notion that the history of the banjo was long and that it stretched across the ocean, but that was about all I knew. The more I've learned, the more I've come to see the history of the banjo in the United States as a parable of the theft at the heart of our colonial heritage. Here at the beginning of Black History Month, I think it's a testament both to the perseverance of the people who wrote early American music and to the blindness and cruelty of people who exploited it for profit. The ancestor of the modern banjo probably originated in West Africa. There, people hollowed out gourds and attached a piece of wood and put strings on it and played music. There's a wonderful display, by the way, of the international history of the banjo at the Musical Instrument Museum up in Scottsdale. These gourd instruments were easy to sort of throw on your back or put in a pack as you traveled. So they spread from Africa to the Middle East to parts of Europe, and through the capture of African people for the slave trade, they spread to America. Here, enslaved people played these instruments and sang together. When they didn't speak the same languages, slaves could often communicate using music. And as English became the language of more enslaved people, they wrote and played songs in English. And here is a critical moment in the history of the banjo in the United States. Of course, white people came into contact with the music of both enslaved and freed black people. And a whole lot of white people were enthralled by what they heard. But rather than offer the black musicians the opportunity to play to audiences and make money for their art, white people devised ways to pretend to be black people. So they rubbed burnt cork on their faces, blackface, and played banjos and sang and danced in a way that represented a white interpretation of African American culture. One story goes this way, as reported by Eric Lott in his book, Love and Theft, Blackface Minstrelsy in the American Working Class. He says, to obtain materials for their shows, or he's quoting someone who said, to obtain materials for their shows, the minstrels visited plantations, then attempted to recreate plantation scenes on the stage. Now, Lott says it's more likely that they were in taverns that were sort of integrated, and they heard this music, and then they tried to recreate plantation scenes, but either way. They listened to the songs, the author says, of the black man as he sat at work in the cotton and sugarcane field, on the steamboats and river docks, and in the tobacco factories. The melodies they heard served as bases for minstrel songs, and they adapted the dances they saw to their needs. And he concludes, the musical instruments that were originally associated with the plantation came to be called Ethiopian instruments in minstrel shows. Banjos, tambourines, fiddles, and bone castanets. So there they would stand on the stage, a line of white men, faces rubbed black, acting out their version of blackness. The blackness that was portrayed in minstrel shows was a fiction. Physical features were made up or exaggerated. Black people were portrayed as simple, always happy, always ready to dance and entertain. But for all the pretending and the construction of this fiction, minstrel shows also played around with the political powder keg that was about to explode in the United States. African Americans, slave and free, were longing for freedom, and that longing was portrayed by white people in minstrel shows, it seems to me, as a way to control that impulse, to name it and act it out and control it. In 1831, you may remember learning in history, or you may not have. A Virginian slave named Nat Turner led a rebellion that killed about 60 people, 51 of whom were white. And Turner was eventually killed, but his insurrection both emboldened other enslaved people and lit the fires of fear in white Americans. So 2 years later, 2 years after Nat Turner's rebellion, the text of one blackface character in a minstrel show went this way: "Should they get to fighting, perhaps the blacks will rise, for their wish is freedom, and it's shining in their eyes. And I caution all white dandies not to come in my way, for if they insult me, they'll in the gutter lay." One imagines white people nervously laughing at this character, the way some of us nervously laugh at a horror show, knowing that the story carries the threat of some of our deepest fears. By making this character fictional and exaggerating his features, minstrels allowed white Americans to laugh at what they feared most: an empowered black man ready to fight for his freedom. But white people, and this is disturbing and important to this story, white people believed that what they were seeing, all the dancing and singing and exaggerated features, many of them believed that what they were seeing was a genuine portrayal of American blackness. As minstrelsy became the most popular form of public entertainment in the American North, entertaining celebrities and politicians, including Abraham Lincoln, it affected portrayals of black people in American literature, including Huckleberry Finn. This image of artificial blackness became as sort of saturated white American culture. The author Lott, who I quoted before, quotes the story of a Union soldier who reported that the black soldiers in his barracks, quote, looked exactly like our minstrels. Think about the through-the-looking-glass nature of that observation. White people blindly accepted the minstrel show as an accurate account of American blackness. And then they measured the appearance of black people by what they saw in minstrel shows. So Northern Americans came to see African Americans in a very patronizing way. No less than Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing wrote in 1840, "We are holding in bondage one of the best races of the human family. The Negro is among the mildest and gentlest of men." End quote. Channing wanted the slaves to be free, but even in his argument, he patronizes black people as being meek and mild as a shared characteristic. Margaret Fuller, the great transcendentalist thinker and once a member of Channing's Unitarian Church, wrote an article in The Dial, a journal, in 1842. She said, "Only our national melody, Yankee Doodle, is shrewdly suspected to be from British art. All invention is confined to the African race, who are, and get this sentence, it wraps me around the axle every time I read it. All invention is confined to the African race, who are relieved by their position from the cares of government." Jump Jim Crow, which is a song that was often played in minstrel shows, is a dance native to this country, she said, and one which we plead guilty to seeing with pleasure, not on the stage, where we have not seen it, but as danced by children of a black hue on the street. Such of the African melodies as we have heard are beautiful, but, she concludes, the Caucasian race have yet their railroads to make. You can almost hear in Fuller's writing a sort of sigh. She seems to have thought, oh, these black folks are so happy all the time, so free of care, if only. Now, Channing and Fuller both worked for freedom for enslaved people and for the abolition of slavery as an institution. But even in that good work, they created a fiction of what life was like for African Americans. Maybe, it seems to me, in an unconscious attempt to soothe their consciences at what was being done to black people in America. Fuller saw this black child dancing and singing Jump Jim Crow in the street for money and believed that that performance was evidence that black people were carefree, that they had more time to be creative and artistic precisely because they were not fully allowed to participate in culture. Now, I try not to skewer the well-intended dead, even though we can see from our vantage point just how flawed their positions were. I figure someday somebody will be looking back at us wondering how in the world we could be so blind. However, I think we have to keep telling these hard-to-hear stories so that we don't make the same mistakes, so that we don't make people into commodities, seeing dollar signs in place of human faces, so that we get beyond what we observe on the surface and learn the deeper truth, so that we approach all people with humility and genuine love and curiosity. It's important to keep telling these stories because blackness is still being co-opted and pretended in 2019. How could I have planned this sermon, which I planned months ago, on a more coincidental Sunday than this one, on which a governor in a southern state is found to have been part of a racist blackface photo and a blackface dance performance in his mid-20s in the 1980s, as recently as the 1980s. That seems pretty obviously heinous to me, wrong. But there's more than the obvious. On the news, in the movies, in the fictional stories we read and see on TV, we're sometimes told by white people what it is to be black in America. We must be careful, I think, in our work on racial justice about the people to whom we're listening and with whom we're in genuine relationship. We must learn, I think, to question whenever we see a portrayal of blackness, who is telling us this story? What perspectives might I be missing? We're called by our faith and the inherent worth and dignity of every person to wake up and to do the work of staying awake to reality. I've learned that bluegrass music, this music that I love dearly, is the grandchild of the minstrel show. Eric Lott said, the rural white tradition and its commercial issue in modern bluegrass music inherited much from the minstrel show, not least the black style of banjo playing, which minstrelsy partly traded. What the heck am I supposed to do with that? What the heck are any of us supposed to do when we find that something we love has a shadow history? That cannot be a new experience for an American person. If it is, we need to keep reading. I think this is a real test of liberal faith because we get passionate. And some of us think the right thing is to put down the instrument, condemn it, and walk away. Other people think we should just ignore those difficult facts. Yes, that's how it came about, but it's a new day after all. But for me, I want to try to walk a middle ground. I think we progressive religious folk are just as likely as anybody else to lose the thread of the stories of marginalized people if our knee-jerk instinct is to walk away when we encounter shadow histories. Instead, I want to lift up the struggle. I want there to be more and more of us who are walking around in the world holding the ambiguity of what we call modern America, where so much of everything we have and do is owed to people who were, if not enslaved, then subjugated. For me and my efforts on the banjo, Faithfulness to my values means that I'll keep reading and researching the instrument's history. It makes me conscious every time I pick up the instrument to practice a song that I'm holding an instrument that goes a lot further back than Earl Scruggs. Any of you know who Earl Scruggs was? Yeah. So I'll research the origins of the songs I play, and when I subject people to my playing in public, I will acknowledge the ancestry of this instrument and the music played on it. If you're interested in that topic in particular, I'd encourage you to cruise by Sule Gregg's website. Hear some of his incredible renditions of early American songs, or listen to the Carolina Chocolate Drops, this all-black folk band with two banjoists who are enormously talented musicians and who are deeply thoughtful about how they present historical pieces. But most of all, I want to lift up the strength of spirit of enslaved people and other subjugated people who kept singing, kept writing and playing music, even as their very lives were being stolen away from them. And thankfully, they weren't all meek and mild. May this Black History Month be a time to honor the past and to celebrate the future of the contribution of people of color in our country. May it inspire us to be more and more awake and to do the work of staying that way. Amen.